Okay, so today, well, I'm talking about something a little bit different from Chris now. I thought I'd talk about some work I did for my PhD, as Bex just mentioned. So, but I'm currently working as a postdoc at the Wolfson Centre. I'm happy to answer questions about what I'm doing at the moment as well, which is focusing more specifically on depression. But my aim for my PhD was to look at the link between ADHD and depression and kind of different factors that explain this relationship. To give you some broad background to my PhD, so ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so typically onsetting in childhood, and it's characterized by three main domains of symptoms. So those are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So inattention is like the inability to concentrate and focus on tasks or having difficulty in that area. Hyperactivity refers to kind of difficulty with sitting still or not kind of running about and walking about when it's kind of inappropriate to do so. And impulsivity refers to difficulty with kind of thinking things through before you act. So ADHD is associated with an increased risk of depression, and we see this in samples both in the clinic and in the general population. But the reasons behind this are not very clear. However, it's important that we look at different reasons that might kind of come in between the path from ADHD to later depression in order to inform how a clinician or how school counsellors, for example, might intervene and prevent depression occurring in children with ADHD. So in my PhD, I focused on a few different potential explanations. So I looked at shared kind of environmental or social risks, so things kind of happening in the child's life that might kind of explain this link. And I also looked at genetic risk, which I'll touch on a bit more briefly at the end, in addition to looking at how ADHD might affect the presentation of depression. So does depression look different when you have ADHD? But today I am going to focus more on these kind of environmental and social risks. So for my PhD, I was really interested in school and friendships as kind of potential risks in the child's life or environment. The reason for this was that friendship and academic difficulties are both associated with ADHD and with depression in separate studies. So one proposed route from ADHD to depression may be via difficulties in these domains. However, there aren't many studies that test this kind of relationship, particularly looking at the relationship over the course of development. So including kind of young childhood into adolescence and kind of early adulthood. So my research question for my first piece of work in my PhD was, do these difficulties with friendships and academic performance contribute to or mediate the link between ADHD and depression? So what I'm talking about when I say mediate is, are these difficulties acting as a middleman, if you like? So is a child with ADHD more likely to experience difficulties with these domains, and then therefore does this increase their risk of later depression? And all of this work is published in the European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Journal. I've included the citation at the bottom if you want to read more. So how I tested this was I used some participants from the Ausbach cohort. So about 2,000 participants from a longitudinal population-based cohort. So essentially in the region of Bristol, kind of wider region around Bristol, thousands of children have been followed since birth, kind of with repeated sort of interviews and questionnaires. So this was the cohort I used to test my research question. I used ADHD symptoms at age 7, which were reported by the parent, self-report peer problems, and also the GCSE results of the child, both at age 16. And then I looked at reported depressive symptoms at age 17. And I've kind of shown how I tested what the model was that I wanted to test at the bottom there. I used linear regressions to test the direct relationship between ADHD and depression. And then I used something called mediation analysis to test the indirect kind of pathway that I've highlighted in grey. So what I found was that ADHD symptoms are associated with adolescent depressive symptoms 10 years later. So as you can see on the graph, as the ADHD symptoms at 7.5 years increased, the children's depressive symptom score 10 years later also increased. And when it came to testing the mediated pathway I was talking about, friendship difficulties and academic difficulties both contributed to part of the relationship between childhood ADHD symptoms and later depressive symptoms. And when I kind of looked at what the relative contribution of each was, friendship seemed to explain about 15% of the link between ADHD and depression, and academic difficulties about 20%. So to give you a conclusion on this first bit of work, these findings support the existence of pathways from ADHD to depression across development via difficulties with friendships and also with academic performance. And this highlights these difficulties as potential targets for preventing depression or intervening in those with ADHD. One of the limitations of this piece of work was that I used a kind of general measure of peer relationship problems. So it was a small questionnaire measure that actually had a lot of different kind of peer relationship problems within it. So it's kind of hard to see what actually is important within that broad measure. So for my next piece of work, I really wanted to focus in on friendships and have a look at what different aspects of friendships might be important in the link between ADHD and depression. So that brings me on to my next piece of work. To give you a bit of background again here, findings in small samples suggest that those with ADHD diagnoses have fewer stable friendships, but we don't know very much about the different features of friendships in those with ADHD, how they're impacted on and how they then impact on later depression symptoms. Friendships can be thought as having three dimensions. Presence, so does the child have friends? How many do they have? And how stable are they over time? Quality of friends, so are these friends, are they good friendships? Are they supportive? Do you feel secure in the friendship? And characteristics of friends, so what kind of person are you friends with? Are they kind of more cooperative type, disruptive, hyperactive, etc. So my research question for this piece of work was which aspects of friendship are more important in the link between ADHD and depression? So I did a kind of similar model to the last time. I was looking at whether these different features of friendship kind of acted as a middleman in the link between ADHD and depression. I also additionally tested whether the relationship of the child with their parent played a role in this. So whether it might affect how friendships kind of affect this link. I'll touch upon that in a bit more detail as I go on. So to test this, I used a sample called STARS, and about 1,700 pupils participated and had the data that I wanted to look at. And this is another longitudinal sample, but based in several schools around Greater London. I used two waves of data that were conducted 7 months apart, one at the beginning of year 7 and one at the end of year 7. That's the first year of secondary school in the UK. And again, I used very similar analysis techniques to kind of test my research questions. How these were measured were mainly questionnaire measures, including a questionnaire measure on parent-child relationship. So the children were asked to name 3 best friends and to report on how stable they were over time, whether they were still friends with them by the end of the year, for example. They were also asked to report on how satisfied they were with these relationships and the quality of these friendships. And they were asked to report on the kind of characteristics of peers in their classroom. And I used this data to kind of look at the characteristics of everybody's friends. So what I found was that ADHD was associated with depression, like the last time. And when I tested what mediated this kind of effect, while the presence and characteristics of friends did not seem to mediate the relationship between ADHD and depression, quality of friendships did seem to be important, accounting for about 9% of this association. So it really seemed to be the quality of the friendship, how supportive they were and how secure the child felt in that friendship, that was important in the link between ADHD and depression over that 7-month time period at school. And I had a quick look at parent-child relationship quality as well, as I mentioned earlier. And I found some evidence to suggest that this mediated effect via friendship quality was smaller, or, kind of less prominent, when the young person reported having a warmer relationship with their mum. So what this might suggest is that having a warm relationship with your mum can compensate somewhat for having poor friendship quality. And this might be helpful in kind of preventing depression in these children with ADHD. To conclude, friendship quality in the context of family relationships seem to be important to consider clinically in those with ADHD for reducing depression risk. And the findings suggested that interventions that improve the parent-child relationship and also friendships may have promise in preventing these depressive outcomes in those with ADHD. Obviously, there's limitations with every study, and one of the limitations of this study was the short follow-up, as it was 7 months kind of compared to 10 years in the study before. Again, if you want to read more about this study, that is published as well. I've got the citation at the bottom there. Just to kind of give you a quick overview of other findings from my PhD, so it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I also looked at genetics. I found a series of kind of areas of the genome, or kind of individuals' genetics, that seem to have a contribution jointly to both ADHD and depression. And these areas of the genome were associated to a smaller extent with academic attainment and other mental health disorders such as anxiety. I also looked at the effect of ADHD symptoms on the clinical presentation of depression, and this was done in a sample of adults who are currently depressed. And I found that ADHD symptoms were associated with a more severe, chronic, and earlier onset depression in this group. ADHD was also associated with other outcomes such as increased risk of self-harm, hospitalization, and taking a non-first-line antidepressant. So really seemed to be indexing a kind of more severe form of depression. And both of these are either in press or published, so if you want to read more, you can. I've had a lot of help through my PhD from lots of lovely people in the wider team, and I've also got my funding there. So with that, I'll thank you for listening, and I welcome many questions.
That's great, thanks, Vicky. We've got a question here from Nikki. Oh, a few questions from Nikki. There's quite a few actually, Vicky. So she's given how underdiagnosed ADHD is generally accepted to be in girls, do you think there is a link between undiagnosed ADHD in girls and an increase in attempted suicide rates in young women?
Yeah, I think that's likely. I haven't tested that myself. I certainly did notice in my work that the relationship always seems to be slightly, but not significantly stronger in girls between ADHD and depression. And obviously we know that girls are more likely to have a missed diagnosis of ADHD. And, this is likely to lead to delayed treatment, which of course is likely to kind of lead to worse outcomes for that group. So that's a really interesting question and a really important one. There's certainly some very interesting research in that area about kind of girls kind of showing higher genetic risk for kind of ADHD if they've been diagnosed with kind of depression and anxiety versus boys. So perhaps being diagnosed with the sort of wrong thing at the wrong time. So yeah, it's a really interesting point. Sorry, I kind of waffled there. That was a helpful answer.
Thank you. Another question from Nikki. How do we improve teacher-parent understanding of ADHD symptoms in girls specifically?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. And again, is something I noticed in my work, that the relationship between ADHD and depression in my second study I was talking about, I didn't actually mention this, the ADHD was rated by the teacher instead of the parent that time. And the association was a bit weaker than we might have expected. And I think that might be because the teachers were underrating slightly compared to perhaps what the parent might have rated. And certainly I can imagine in girls, this might be a particular issue. I've read papers that kind of suggest that teachers are more likely perhaps to rate people as having ADHD symptoms if they're more of the hyperactive subtype of ADHD rather than the inattentive. And of course, there is some evidence to suggest that boys are more likely to have the kind of more hyperactive presentation compared to girls, who are more likely to have inattentive. In terms of improving that, I guess from a research perspective, kind of research that really tries to focus in on those research questions and draw attention to perhaps, missed cases of girls with ADHD, may help inform policy, like kind of what Chris was talking about earlier, and hopefully have an impact in schools, for example. Yeah. Thank you.
And there's been a couple of questions, Vicky, relating to meaningful friendships.
Yeah.
So from Nikki, how can we support meaningful friendships in school, outside school, as an insulating effect for depression? From Emma, what interventions would you propose to target friendships in a meaningful way?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Vex.
No, go ahead. That's okay.
So I can probably answer those two in kind of a melded answer. There are some interventions that are kind of being trialed at the moment that I know of. There's one called PEERS, I believe, is the acronym. And they found some kind of preliminary evidence that their intervention might be helpful in children, in a very small sample of children with ADHD. And it's a friendship building program with a parental component, which kind of sort of fits into my findings in the last study there. That, in addition to kind of trying to encourage a child to build better friendships, involving the parent might make the intervention much more effective. There have kind of been previous interventions trying to focus on the child's social skills, and there's really very little evidence that the effects of those interventions are very long lasting for the child. So I think by focusing kind of more on friendship building and involving the parent in that might be it's kind of early days in that research, I think, but it looks like it might be more promising. So this study found that by using this intervention, the children had initiated more friendships. They'd hosted more get-togethers with the help of their parent, with children from school. And they also seemed to show a bit more awareness of like social kind of skills in a sort of test they completed at the end. Yes, that's the PEERS intervention, if you're interested. But that's just one example, I guess. There's plenty of interventions out there that have been developed or are being kind of worked on.
Thanks, Vicky. Another question on friendships again. If a child has a poor friendship quality, consequently has a high school non-attendance rate, does this lead to poor academic achievement and then depression? Your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And definitely when I was writing my thesis up, and I had to consider all these kind of different complex interactions that could be happening between the different things I was measuring. And yeah, that could well be a kind of potential explanation of results I've seen. Certainly, I didn't measure school dropout at any point, but that would be quite interesting to look at as well. But yes, they both seem to be contributing kind of independently, academic attainment, and friendship problems. But yeah, it's completely conceivable that one is affecting the other in a kind of more complex pathway.
Thank you. And one final question from Siobhan, Vicky. She said, really interesting, thank you. And are there any plans to link to some of the Welsh ACEs research, considering that trauma can impact on development, biology, and exploring other neurodiverse categories?
So that's so interesting, and thank you for your question. I've not worked in that area myself yet, but it is something I find really interesting. I think the literature in that area is really, really interesting. And I have thought about it myself before, kind of how that could be linked in. It's not something I've done yet, but yeah, definitely something to consider kind of for future work. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you everyone for your questions on that. And thank you, Vicky, for